Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. If you want to get involved with ASA, you can go to their Facebook page and simply click like, and then you'll see all their posts. ASA shares a lot of relevant information for animal studies scholars, conferences, calls for papers, jobs, funding opportunities, etc., etc. So if you're not following ASA on Facebook, you should be. Go over to the ASA Facebook page. That's the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, once again, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from the lovely city of Canterbury and particularly the University of Kent. Once again, it is quite a misty day outside, very kind of romantic and beautiful looking through the window, but also nice to be on the inside where it's nice and warm. And once again, I'm joined by one of the fabulous animal studies scholars here at the University of Kent. This week, I'm joined by Peter Adkins. Peter is an Assistant Lecturer and Ph.D. candidate in the School of English at the University of Kent. And today we're going to discuss his article, The Eyes of That Cow, Eating Animals and Theorizing Vegetarianism in James Joyce's Ulysses, which appeared in the journal Humanities in 2017. Welcome to the podcast, Peter.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter, take us through it. What inspired this work?
So really was a sense that the animals in James Joyce's novel Ulysses hadn't really been given the critical attention that they deserved, and particularly Joyce's interest in the question of vegetarianism in the early 20th century. Now, I'm aware probably many of your listeners will know and perhaps have read Ulysses, but for those who haven't, Ulysses was a novel published by the Irish writer James Joyce in 1922. Joyce is considered probably one of the greatest novelists of the 20th century. He's an important modernist novelist in the sense that his writing is highly experimental. He lived most of his adult life in continental Europe, but the subject of his writing was invariably Dublin and Ireland more generally. Ulysses itself is a long and very experimental piece of fiction. It's not primarily about animals, it's primarily about three human characters, Stephen Dedalus, Leopold Bloom, and Leopold Bloom's wife, Molly. But interestingly, it's a long book, and there's a sort of critical in-joke, which is that whatever you're looking for, you will find in Ulysses. And there's lots of animals in Ulysses, and there's lots about eating and eating animals as well. So this was the particular path I decided to take. And once I started digging, there was a lot to go on there. So Joyce, to offer a little more context, came up as a writer in the early 20th century during a time in which there was what was known as the Celtic Revival or the Gaelic Revival, which was this interest in Irish literature. Perhaps most famously of those writers was W.B. Yeats. And W.B. Yeats wanted Joyce to sort of join the gang, so to speak. Interestingly, Yeats and other revivalists such as George Russell were vegetarians, and part of Joyce's rejection of being part of this sort of literary gang was a rejection of their vegetarianism. And it was really this particular point that started my thinking about Joyce's thoughts on vegetarianism, how they change and develop over the course of his writing.
How wonderful. Wow, I've not read the book myself. I fear it would be too much for me, but I certainly am aware of it. It's a cultural phenomenon. So there's so much to discuss here. Peter, can you start by telling us a little bit about the lives of animals in this period, animal agriculture, how people would have engaged with and seen animals?
So in Ireland at the turn of the century, agriculture really was really structured Ireland's economy. It's very interesting to look back the statistical history. There's been quite a lot of statistical history about the importance, particularly of the cattle industry in Ireland in the late 19th, early 20th century. So there's some quite startling statistics, such as that half of Ireland's entire land surface was being used for the raising of cattle. Something like 2/3 of Ireland's GDP was reliant on the cattle industry as well. And Joyce is alert to this fact. He makes Leopold Bloom, this principal character in Ulysses, his background is working in the cattle market, and he lives for a short while in this hotel which historically was frequented by cattle drovers and market workers. So Joyce takes pains to really embed the novel within this historical context where agriculture really did structure day-to-day life. So often critics are attempted to look at how the novel is interested in modernity and emergent technologies, but the novel's actually got sort of one foot in each camp. It's looking at this sort of transitional movement from a sort of agrarian economy to this sort of more modern technological economy.
Wonderful. And so then another thing that's going on at the same time is the emergence of vegetarianism. And I, my father grew up in Dublin, perhaps around this time. I must say my father's quite elderly, I have to say. But when I think about vegetarianism, I think about England, I think about Britain. But of course, I'm sure Ireland also had this same emerging vegetarianism. Can you tell us about this scene and who was involved and what it represented?
Sure. Well, I think actually your intuition there is right. And one thing that a lot of the Irish public were quite suspicious of was the way in which this cultural elite, these revivalists who are all vegetarian, might have actually been influenced by sort of an English cultural ideal. So there's definitely this question of Englishness and vegetarianism. There's also theosophy, which was really the primary reason that these revivalists who are very interested in mysticism and spiritualism, this was really underpinning their vegetarianism. They believed that if you ate meat, the animal passions would enter your bloodstream and you'd be sort of become more irrational, or even go so far as to consume the soul of the animal. And this is in fact where the title of my paper comes from, in which Leopold Bloom runs into someone coming from the vegetarian restaurant, and he sort of laughs at him for this idea that the eyes of that cow might be haunting him through eternity. So Joyce is very skeptical of vegetarianism as it's practiced by these sort of revivalist theosophists.
And there's also a story about masculinity in there as well. Can you tell us how meat and masculinity are connected?
Sure. So this is where I think when we read Joyce's novel, we can see Joyce we can not only historicize vegetarianism, but we can see a sort of theory of meat-eating vegetarianism that actually might have something to say to contemporary studies around veganism. So my thinking here is influenced by scholars such as Carol Adams and Laura Wright, and their connection between meat and the way meat has certain cultural associations and constructions of masculinity and acts of misogyny. Interestingly, we see this, again, Joyce is ahead of us all here. He has it in Ulysses. There's a moment, for instance, in the very first chapter in which we meet Leopold Bloom, where he's sitting down to eat his kidney for breakfast, which to me sounds like a very disgusting breakfast, particularly because Leopold Bloom likes it because it has this tang of urine. So Joyce is really interested in sort of the sort of visceralness of meat itself. But anyway, when he's tucking into his kidney, he mistakes the word kidney for kiddie, and he's thinking of his daughter, and he's already had these sort of semi-incestuous thoughts about his daughter Millie, whose name sounds a bit like his wife Molly. So this is probably the first instance in which we get a direct connection between eating meat and somehow this sort of masculine patriarchal sovereignty. But we see examples throughout the novel. There's a sort of fantastical chapter later on in which Bloom goes through all sorts of animal transformations, but also goes through a gender swap, so he becomes female, and what is seen as this sort of the heightened moment of sort of sadomasochist arousal is being skewered and slaughtered. And so there's this idea of gender dynamics coming into play with meat eating again. We also get this much earlier in the novel with the other character, Stephen Dedalus, in the very, very first chapter of the novel. In fact, just a couple of pages in, we get this description of an old woman who comes to deliver the milk to Stephen and his friends. And this old woman is symbolized as this sort of Irish Mother Nature figure, and Joyce is ironizing this sort of idea that femininity and nature and consumption of milk, which the obvious connection between Mother Nature and Mother Island sustaining the population. Joyce is interested in sort of bringing these gendered ideas to the surface of the text, and it's quite remarkable, I think, that the animals and this question of how Joyce is interested in these animals hasn't really been fully excavated. It's only now scholars are really seeing this for the first time.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. So then, in your analysis, you then turn to Elizabeth Costello to try and help you make sense of some of this. Can you tell us why Coetzee is influential or significant in thinking through these issues?
Yeah, it's a curious pairing, perhaps, because interestingly, Coetzee has admitted that he doesn't have a lot of love for Ulysses. I think, and maybe this isn't entirely right, I think he has said somewhere that he didn't make it to the end of the novel. He's not a Joycean. He's into other modernist writers like Samuel Beckett, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, but he's not a Joycean. But what is interesting is the character Elizabeth Costello is said to have come to notoriety as a writer for writing this book in which she writes a sort of sequel to Ulysses. She writes a book from the perspective of Molly Bloom, which takes her out of 7 Eccles Street, which is the house in which Molly Bloom lives with Leopold. And yet also, at the same time, Elizabeth Costello is an animal rights activist, or she's interested in the lives of animals. And when I first read the book, I really wanted to try and find a connection between the two. Why Ulysses? Why this sort of writer is a sort of writing back to Ulysses, and why animals? What's the link? I think now there probably isn't a strong link. I think it probably just was convenient for Coetzee to have her write back to Ulysses as a sort of any famous text. But I think what's interesting is in the novel Elizabeth Costello, she talks about the fact that she can get into the mind of Molly Bloom in the same way that she gets into the mind of animals. And this opens up for Coetzee a way of writing about what he calls the sympathetic imagination, in which he likens the capacity to empathize with other animals to the capacity when we read novels to empathize with fictional characters. So then I was interested in the role of the imagination, and I tried to bring this into my analysis of Ulysses to think about the way in which Joyce is also interested in the sympathetic imagination. He's also interested in the way the mind works when we have an encounter with an animal in which sympathy or empathy is required. So there's a scene in Ulysses in which Leopold Bloom is travelling through Dublin, and the carriage he's travelling in is suddenly brought to a halt by a drove of branded cattle. And it's in this encounter we start to see Joyce experimenting with... this is really where his modernist experimentation comes to the fore. We see him experimenting with perspective, character's perspective. The narrative itself slips between a first-person perspective to a third person. We get interesting fragments of dialogue, and what we get is this sense that Joyce is really trying to get on the page the experience of having a sympathetic, imagining encounter with an animal.
Wow. So overall, what do you think this tells us about the human non-human animal relationship, or what's the big learning, would you say?
I think that one thing that it reveals is that it's not only us recent scholars who are interested in these questions, that if we go back and we read through literary history, even much further than the early 20th century, we see writers engaging with questions of ethics, eating, animals, non-human life, in ways that aren't only interesting to sort of historicize and build up this picture of our historical engagement with animals, but also they can still stage interventions in our thinking. Joyce's Ulysses, I think, is particularly powerful because, well, when I read what he has to say about vegetarianism, it challenges me and my thinking about veganism, for instance. It can make me think more carefully about my own sense of ethical responsibility. So, yeah, I suppose that's my sort of twofold answer to that question.
Wonderful. Well, Peter, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yeah, sure.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I think it was Carrie Wolf's book, Animal Rights. And then I went on to read his other books, such as What is Posthumanism and Before the Law. Those books probably had more an influence on my thinking, but it was that first book, Animal Rights, I can still picture very clearly going to the library and getting it out and discovering that there was a way of thinking about animals and ethics and ontology in literature in ways that I hadn't really considered before.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I can, because it's actually this article. So this article was the first article I've had published. So it's this one.
Fantastic. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I know your guests tend to cheat on this. And
do.
I'm not going to cheat too much. I'm just going to name 2 people. So, sort of on an intellectual plane, it would be Derrida. He's probably been the key influence on my thinking, especially I found with Derrida that whenever I was interested in a subject, he'd already written on it and he'd sort of written amazing stuff. So when I started thinking about vegetarianism, I realized he'd written an essay in the 1980s on precisely the ethics of vegetarianism and the limits. He'd also written this very important essay, or it actually began as a lecture, The Animal That Therefore I Am, which speaks about, again, animal ethics and ontology, but also thinking about his writing that seems to have less to do explicitly with animals, such as his early writing where he talks about literature and words themselves as being kind of animals, or the logic in which they literature operates as having a kind of animality to it. Has really shaped my thinking. So that's a sort of intellectual debt I owe to Derrida, but on a sort of more personal level, but also intellectual, I would name Derek Ryan, who's my PhD supervisor here at Kent and a wonderful animal studies scholar, and also a wonderful supervisor. He's really been very encouraging. He was responsible for introducing me to animal studies in the first place. So he's had a big influence on me.
Fantastic. No, very nice to hear of a warm PhD student-supervisor relationship, particularly in animal studies. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think the most important things are to ask awkward questions, to ask questions that people don't really want to be asked. I think there's still a tendency to think of animal studies as sort of a subfield or a subgenre of approaching cultural, literary, or historical questions. And I think actually where the important work to do is to sort of introduce it into more broad, general conversations about these same topics, and to ask these awkward questions: who's being excluded in this narrative? Why aren't we addressing this aspect that seems to impinge on questions of animal life or other species? So yeah, I think that's what animal studies should do.
Wonderful. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
This is a really hard question, and I was thinking about this earlier today. I think I would actually just change something on the human side of that equation, which would be that the political and social systems that we have were more disposed to be inclusive of species other than humans. And it would be as simple as that, I think, to just be more inclusive.
Wonderful. Well, Peter, what are you working on next?
So I'm currently working on, very slowly working on an article looking at the way in which animal labour is presented also in James Joyce's Ulysses. There's more to be said about Ulysses and animals yet.
Wonderful.
But I'm also looking at a few other modernist writers. So I'm working on a edited collection of essays on the modernist writer Virginia Woolf and the post-humanist philosopher Rosie Braidotti, which will have some articles in it on animals. And I'm also finishing my thesis, which has lots of animals in it too.
Wonderful. So you're very busy.
Yes.
How can people find out more about your work?
Probably the best place is Twitter. If you look up P_Adkins87 on Twitter, you'll find me there. And I don't tweet very much, but I'll tweet occasionally about what I'm doing, and people can always get in touch with me through that.
Wonderful. Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about their work. Now you can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. You can follow me at SO_S. There's also a Knowing Animals Facebook page. There's a Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan Facebook page. And finally, don't forget to leave us a review at iTunes. Reviews make us go up higher in the rankings and therefore make it easier for other people to find the podcast and to learn about animals and animal studies. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.